Could you write an example in the poem itself? And of course, you have to perform the example.
Of this poem, I think that is quite cynical, quite angry, and that is aiming to in one way or another celebrate the possibility of reparations, and the possibility that the British will be as traumatized by this invasion as the Jamaican people were traumatized by British enslavement and colonization. You know, that I don't know. I'd be curious to know if your students saw any revenge fantasy components.
Yeah, I like the revenge reading. That hadn't been my primary one, but I agree that that's there as a sort of underlying tone through the whole thing. One thing I was just remembering as I'm glancing at it is how the use of Jamaican English is necessary for the rhymes to work. So for example, in the first stanza where the rhymes are burst and reverse, right? You have to have the final consonant cluster deletion on burst for it to be a full rhyme with reverse. And so that sort of playfulness of it actually depends. It's not that it's not an extra feature, right? It's intrinsic to the poetic project for those rhymes to work, right? Where you have town and bound. And again, those are perfect full rhymes if you have final consonant cluster deletion. And that goes all the way through. And I kind of love it, the way that turnabout and mount rhyme, because you have the interdental turns into an alveolar, and thus that's a perfect rhyme. And it's sort of enforcing that rhyme to work. It means that either you're going to be part of the colonization project if you read it right, in a sense, right? It puts the language in your mouth of the sort of re-Englishing, that the poem is proposing. So it's sort of colonizing you as a reader, which sort of underscores that image of threat, perhaps, or recolonization.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the English Department's Literature, Language, Culture, a Dialogue series. We have two guests with us today, Colette and Laura. Will each of you introduce yourselves? And maybe Colette, will you open for us?
Hi, I'm Colette Moore. I'm an associate professor in the English department, and I work on history of the English language. So the way English has changed over its history from being a language spoken by inconsequential Germanic tribes on a tiny island off the North Sea to the international language that it is today, spoken by more than 1 billion people all around the world. And so the journey that takes through sort of linguistic features is what I mostly focus on.
I'm Laura Chrisman, Nancy K. Ketchum Endowed Chair of English. I specialize in post-colonial literature, culture, and theory, and this involves me in looking at the literary cultural productions of empire, specifically the British Empire in my case, and looking at the cultural literary productions of those who resisted empire and engaged in decolonization. My own particular region is Southern Africa, but I teach a variety of African and Caribbean, Black British, and some Black American material as well.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And we're going to just jump right in. So I understand that you brought a poem as kind of your centerpiece to talk about today. Would you mind introducing that poem? And then I'm going to say now for our listeners and viewers that we're going to try and have a recording of the poem and its performance play for you. And if we don't succeed in that, you'll get a notice on screen showing you where to go listen to the performance. Or if you're listening to the podcast version, you'll see that there's a link in the description of the episode. But before we jump into that, what is the poem? Why did you select it? And what does it have to do with the two fields that you work in?
How about I give a sort of a background of why we picked it, and then Laura can talk about the poem itself. We picked it because Laura and I co-taught a course maybe 2 years ago. It was a graduate class, and it was on the literature and language of the post-colonial world. So what about the post-colonial situation created a sort of unique backdrop to the creation of literary texts and the ways that they used language, because language is a political project and literature is a political project. And so how did those overlap? So we taught this course together and it was so much fun. It was really great. It was one of my favorite teaching experiences ever because I had Laura as an interlocutor there every day in the classroom and I learned so much. I haven't gotten to take a course myself in post-colonial literature and I learned so much about post-colonial theory. So that's sort of the background of why we picked this poem and what made us think about it. And then maybe Laura, if you could talk a little bit about the poem itself.
Yeah, it is a now canonical poem by a leading vernacular Jamaican poet, popularly known as Miss Lou, otherwise Louise Bennett. And the poem's called Colonization in Reverse. And this was a poem that Miss Lou wrote and started to perform in the mid-1960s. It has embedded in it a rich, multi-layered commentary on the phenomenon of Caribbean and Asian arrivals into a post-war, post-colonial Britain, commentary that is a critique of the British Empire at the same time that it's a celebration, arguably, of the new opportunities of multicultural British metropolitan life. So it's an extremely ambiguous and playful poem that begins with an exultation about the arrival in droves of Jamaican immigrants, and then it concludes with a rather more barbed suggestion that the resident British are being placed in an uncomfortable situation as a result of this arrival. And this is, I should say, an arrival that was invited by the British government in the light of...
Did you already use the term Windrush as the name of it?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, so the Windrush generation.
Mm-hmm. The Windrush generation, named after the boat of 1948, the Empire Windrush, that was seen as, it's the iconic, probably first arrival of Caribbean populations invited to the UK to help build a much devastated Britain, devastated by the ravages of World War II. And the arrivals entered the labor force, often in unskilled, but some in highly skilled jobs. It was the beginning of Britain's reckoning with its empire. 1948, the empire was still going strong. By the time Miss Lou pens this poem, Jamaica has recently become independent, and many African countries have also become independent. And there is a backlash underway within mainland Britain against those very same immigrants that had been invited in the 1940s and 50s. And it should be said that the backlash resulted in legislation to limit immigrants, and it also ignored or disavowed the fact that the British economy was even more dependent by this time on the labor of the Commonwealth, so that to this day, the National Health Service, for instance, would collapse without the input of Commonwealth nurses, doctors, and other health workers. So the poem offers a commentary on labor and the labor of immigrants and the option that they have to choose not to labor on arrival also, and to go on the dole, which is a British phrase for receiving unemployment benefit.
Colette and Laura, how does this poem intersect across your different fields? And I'm hearing very clearly how this relates to your work, Laura, in post-colonialism and decolonial work in that time period, right? And maybe diaspora a little bit. Colette, how does it intersect with your work? How does the poem fit at that little Venn diagram of the work you two are doing?
Yeah, well, I work on language studies really rather than literature primarily. And for language studies, poems like this that are written in what have been called dialect poetry or nation language, sometimes I dialect, the ways that a written text can represent a spoken sound, where we use spelling to indicate phonological features, where we use the word order and the syntactic choices to represent the syntactic features of varieties of English. It's useful in two reasons. And one is that it becomes sort of evidence for what are the features that characterize varieties of English. And sometimes it's not like actual evidence like a recording would be. It's evidence of the perceptual dialectology of the things that are marked for speakers, right? The things that speakers think of as the features that go with a variety of English. And so that's one reason it's interesting. And the other reason it's interesting is that our tools for analyzing dialects of English can be applied to reading the literary text. And therefore we have a sharper perspective on how the nuts and bolts of it are working. So I would say that the relationship between literary and language studies is a little bit porous. There's a lot of sort of technical background in sort of analyzing aspects of syntax, say, that are maybe not as interesting to literary people. But in something like a poem like this, you can really see how it's both, how it's both really interesting as a literary document, but also as a piece of an archive of linguistic evidence, how it really helps us to know a little bit more about real people and their real language.
Okay, so we've heard some of the dialect in the poem. Can you talk a little bit why you chose to have someone else perform the poem? And then maybe point to some places in the poem they're doing some of the work across your disciplines, and any like quotes or kind of research you've seen around the poem that you think are particularly salient.
I'll let Colette start.
One reason, so I teach in a course I was teaching this term, I teach some poems that are in nation language. Actually, why don't I stop and define that term? So nation language is coined by a Caribbean poet, Kamau Brathwaite, who decided that the term dialect poetry sounded too diminishing. It sounded too pejorative, and it didn't grant the sort of authenticity and legitimacy of a tradition that is written in poetry, that is written in the oral language of people in a community. So he coined the term nation language to elevate the choice, the aesthetic choice, to choose oral features, to choose varieties of English as the medium for poetry. And it's an old tradition. Laura maybe could speak about some of the older parts of it, but think of, say, Robert Burns in the 18th century, where choosing, it's a sort of romantic, capital R, romantic poetic tradition of trying to use varieties of English in poetic construction. And it gains sort of force in the 19th century. There are sort of more rural dialects, William Barnes writing in, and the poets in Lancashire writing in sort of varieties of English. And then in the post-colonial setting, it really gains new vigor with sort of poets being captured. And in fact, sometimes you see overlap between the layers of the colonial setting where like the author Amos Tutuola was circulated in part by the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas, where we sort of have a sort of lionizing of the choice of nation language and the legitimacy and authenticity of using spoken language. I've even lost now what we're talking about. Laura, do you want to go?
It's interesting to bring in as a contrasting example here, Black American vernacular poetry of late 19th, early 20th century, because in the American context, and I'm thinking of poems by Paul Laurence Dunbar, James Weldon Johnson, and Claude McKay, though he's Jamaican, but an honorary American at the same time. So in the US context, the use of Black English carried a very definite charge and created very emphatic, I'm choosing my words very carefully here, emphatic response in that it was seen too often to be perpetuating racist stereotypes, and to use non-standard English was to signal, was seen as being at risk of signaling the cognitive deficiencies of the speaker. But in the case of Robert Burns, Scottish vernacular or Jamaican, that charge is really not applicable. There's much more of an affirmative nationalist self-determination expressed in a pretty overt way through the choice of non-standard English. I mean, would you agree, Colette?
Yeah, and I now remember that our initial question was why we wouldn't perform it aloud, or why I would hesitate to perform an entire poem written in a variety of English that wasn't mine. And I think the answer is partly that language is so closely tied to identity, to our sense of selfhood, to the communities that we're part of, to the way that we're a product of our own personal histories. And because a poem that's written in nation language is emphasizing that, then to me that's a moment where it's really capturing a particular identity of a community, in this case, Jamaican English or Jamaican patois, depending on, it's sort of walking in between those two. And since that isn't my variety of English, then for me, it's one thing to sort of talk about a line here and there as a reader, because the poem is shared with me, and it's different to perform it, because then to me, the voice should be authentic. The voice should be someone who speaks Jamaican English and thus can inhabit that identity. So to me, there's a difference between the way that a poem is written to read and to share, and the way that it's written to perform and to sort of voice the whole, voice the poem as a whole.
Yeah. And one of the things I find fascinating about this poem is that Miss Lou, throughout her writing and performing, performs the role of the folk, the people. But she was actually a highly educated actress, first Black person trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. She was an established academic, folklorist, so that, which is not to say that she's in any way being inauthentic in the persona that she assumes in writing and performing this poem, but that it is a choice that she is making, having achieved a level of metropolitan validation and legitimacy through her educational credentials, So it is a very self-conscious act of identification with the masses. And that is in itself further complicated by the way in which the poem can be performed with varying degrees of, let's say, nation language inflection. So that's one of the issues that Colette and I were debating over the different performances that are available out there now of this poem.
Yeah, and so linguists talk about this as being something that often in a post-colonial setting, so post-colonial settings tend to be places where contact has happened in the past, right? Where often linguists talk about Pidgins and Creole languages, and those emerge starting often on trade routes. So in fact, the word Pidgin comes from a Chinese pronunciation of business, right? So a business language, a trade language, because when two peoples get together and they speak different languages as primary languages, you don't need a lot to make a trade situation work, right? You need a sort of a limited vocabulary, very, very minimal amount of syntax. And so that Pidgin language that emerges is enough to allow that, that trade situation to happen. As trade languages, as Pidgin languages become the native languages of communities, or as a community meshes more thoroughly the two languages, then what you have is a Creole language situation where you really have a lot more sort of meshing of those traditions. And Jamaican Creole, Jamaican patois, sometimes called Jamaican English, is that situation where you really have a sort of a deep meshing of language traditions because of the history of the slave trade, because of the colonial settlements, because of years of different kinds of contact. And so it sort of walks the line between, on the one hand, a formal Jamaican English, and on the other hand, a sort of Jamaican patois, which is the spoken language, the language that most people use in their daily lives. And in Jamaica, you would maybe navigate those as for levels of formality, for how written down the text was. A university might steer more towards Jamaican English and away from patois, but in the market you would speak patois. And so that setting is something that Miss Lou totally played with and mastered. I mean, really develops a kind of a beautiful control over those choices. Hey, Laura, I was wondering, I don't know as much about this, but it's so playful, and the rhyme and the meter of it sort of sing-songy. Is that common? I mean, I just don't know a lot of post-colonial poetry where you have stuff that sort of rhymed and playful. Is that unique to Miss Lou?
Pardon me?
Is that unique to Miss Lou?
I don't believe so, but I think the oral flavor that she evokes is very, and the rhythmic quality of it is very widespread in a range of Caribbean poets, both those that write primarily for the page and those that write primarily to perform. But some of that rhythm and rhyming derives, I would say, from music. And this poem I read is very much drawing from kind of pan-Caribbean traditions of calypso, of carnival, that informs the ideology of the poem as well, in which those that are subjugated are in traditional carnival structures. Those that are subjugated are given license for a day or two to become the play rulers. It's a strategy of containment. Let people take charge every now and then, symbolically, and the hope is that will dissipate the social, political friction. So I see, I've wandered beyond your question, Colette, but yeah, I think music and the radical political, cultural traditions associated with certain music practices is what's going on here. And
that makes so much sense, because I was teaching this term. I taught this poem paired with a little snippet of Kamau Brathwaite's The Dust and a little snippet of Derek Walcott's Homeros, just to show different strategies that Caribbean poets use. And this was the only one the students connected with. The others were such sort of arcane poetic projects. The Brathwaite is much less accessible. It's more, in a sense, authentic. It's more sort of steering towards the goal of authentic representation rather than this one. But because this one is so playful, and because it's so much like a piece of music, so much like a piece of performance, they really connected with it and got the project.
So at the end of every episode, I always ask, like, what about reading this type of work gives you hope?
One thing I like, and this is really kind of talking about the points you were just making, is the way that it laughs and invites us to laugh and laughs at us at the same time, right? Where like you actually have represented in the poem this sort of, let's see, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, stanza 7, where it begins with, oh no, see how life is funny, oh no. And it writes the laugh into the poem in a sense. And it's, on the one hand, it's a laugh that invites us to have fun, to have a good time. And on the other hand, it's a slightly mean laugh, right? It's a slightly, there's a thread of laughing at the British, of laughing at the colonial situation, of laughing at resistance, or sort of promoting resistance. And I like how it walks that line. It's nicely done.
I would say too, that very quality of laughter that is so deeply subversive, cynical, and affirmative at the same time, is gives me hope, because it shows an indomitability. It shows something that goes beyond resilience and survival, but further gestures towards creativity, the ability to both observe and transform through the imagination adversity into freedom. And so, yeah, something about this celebration of cultural and aesthetic and ontological creativity, freedom, that gives me hope.
I love how you put that. And I like to, like, for me, that's a perfect way to think about how the literary and the linguistic kind of mesh, because the literary, as you're talking about, the creativity, the way that literary narratives become a site of resistance, become a sort of future looking way for people to own their stories. Languages too, and the way that sort of English, sometimes the story of English is told as English as an oppressor language, and thus anyone who speaks English is giving in to sort of an oppressive regime. But England doesn't own English, and anyone who speaks it owns it. And there are more speakers of English in India or Nigeria right now than there are in the United Kingdom. And there's a way in which, as it is spoken as a native language by people all over the world, everyone owns it. And I love how it has a history of sort of a colonial setting, but the minute people speak it and make it their own, then it is also a site of resistance. And so I like how, like, a poem like this, we can really see both the sort of the literary creativity and also the linguistic creativity, the way that a people, in making a language their own it, right? And become that English is co-created as a language. One thing I was going to ask you about, Laura, and I don't know if this is a productive question or if it's one that wouldn't be, but sort of in your connection to the Black scholar, that I wondered if you might talk about sort of that project and maybe how it has overlapped with things like dialect poetry and the analysis of that. And I don't know if that's a question that would lead to something good, but I'd be interested to hear you answer it.
Wow. Okay, that's a complicated one. I would need a little more time to address that with the nuance it deserves, but the Black Scholar journal, because my father, who founded it, was a poet, it featured a lot of poetry, unusual still for Black studies and racial and ethnic studies journals to give so much space to poetry. And because he was an internationalist, he included poetry from across the Black world. And that meant a lot of Caribbean poetry found its way into both Anglophone and Hispanophone, particularly reflecting his travels in Nicaragua and Cuba. But also Linton Kwesi Johnson was involved at the Black Scholar journal, and it is fair to say that there's quite a bit of nation language poetry over the 50 years or more now of the Black Scholar journal. And the George Lamming speech that I read from, that's also from a special issue that the Black Scholar did on Casa las Americas. So yeah, I think that there's something about the way that poetry, poets, the unacknowledged legislators of the world, poetry has been this glue for this journal, and that it isn't always recognized as having had such a major role in this journal, nor is poetry always recognized as having such a major role in post-colonial, anti-colonial literary production. Narrative forms tend to lionize, one might say even imperialize the field. And so there's something for me particularly significant about the way that poetry, poetics, nation language, and post-colonial studies all converge in this journal and in conversation in the department.